Hey everybody, this is Eric Lopez, also known as Blue Beetle and the Scarab, and you're listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files.
Hello team, welcome back to Whelmed Reprints. It's the holiday season here in the States, so we'll be taking time to spend with our families and to get ready for Season 3, premiering on January 4th, 2019. With Whelmed Reprints, our team will be picking a few of our favorite episodes to bring to new listeners. Our fourth reprint merges two of my all-time favorite interviews into one listening experience. Jeff Stormer is the creator and host of the Party of One podcast. I'd known about his podcast for a while, but the first time Jeff and I ever interacted was on the DM's Block game show Geek Wars, in which Jeff and I were on opposite teams, dueling it out on all things comic. I used to say I'd been humbled by Jeff in that competition, but now that I know his secret, I'm happy I was able to stay anywhere near him. In part one of this collection, we invited Jeff on to talk about the quirkier parts of the DC universe, the mythology of the Fourth World, Apocalypse, New Genesis, and the epic villain of DC, Darkseid. What we got was a college-level course that included all of that, plus the history of comic legend Jack Kirby. Not to oversell it, but Jeff also managed to change how I look at Superman stories forever. So, of course, we asked him back. This time to talk about a character largely alluded to in Season 2, Ted Kord, the predecessor to Jaime Reyes in the Blue Beetle line. I joke at the beginning of that episode about Jeff having restructured my brain during our Fourth World interview, so I was expecting the same this time around. It really had been a joke, but then he did it. Charlton Comics, Captain Atom, Blue Beetle, The Question, Peacemaker, the history of the revolutionary miniseries The Watchmen. He could write a dissertation on this material, and we now refer to him as Professor Stormer here in the Watchtower. What you may not know is that after that second interview, when we were off mic, I told him that I couldn't believe the information that he was shelling out. I feel like I know my DC pretty well, but he makes me feel like I should tear up my geek card. His reply, well, it makes sense. I do have a degree in it. Of course, my response was, a degree in what? It turns out that when I asked him for biographical info for his introduction to those episodes, he failed to mention that he has an English degree with an emphasis on graphic literature, aka comics. So, yeah, that's why I'm happy I managed to get anything over him on Geek Wars. We will definitely be having him back on to chat about the Fourth World's influence on Season 3, but until then, we hope you enjoy today's double-length collection and your upcoming holiday season. Stay whelmed, everyone.
Recognized, Uncle Walker, D01. Recognized, Party of One, D14.
That man won't quit as long as he can still draw a breath. None of my teammates will. Me? I've got a different problem. I feel like I live in a world made of cardboard, always taking constant care not to break something, to break someone. Never allowing myself to lose control, even for a moment, or someone could die. But you can take it, can't you, big man? What we have here is a rare opportunity for me to cut loose and show you just how powerful I really am.
Today in the cave, I am excited to bring you Jeff Stormer. Jeff is the host of the fantastic actual play podcast, Party of One. Party of One focuses on two-player games, bringing guests on to tell intimate and sometimes heartbreaking stories from a variety of gaming systems. Recently, Jeff invited me onto the show to play Dan Ender's painfully brilliant The Bite, in which Jeff and I played ourselves trapped in a room during a zombie apocalypse. The twist? One of us may have been bitten, and there's only one gun with one bullet in the room. That game haunts me to this day in all the right ways. Jeff,
Me too.
Jeff, I'm so excited to welcome you to the cave. There are no firearms and no zombies.
Oh, thank goodness. Rich, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
You bet. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that our discussion sessions draw on anything and everything related to Young Justice, including both seasons of the series so far, the comics, and the video game. If you have not seen, read, or played all of the material and are spoiler wary, please consider this your warning. And with all of that, let's dive in. I touched on a few things in the intro, Jeff, but tell us a little more about who you are and what you do.
Sure, I do 2 podcasts. They're both role-playing game-centric podcasts. Party of One, the one you mentioned, is an actual play focused on 2-player role-playing games, either games designed for 2, like The Bite, or games that are sort of compatible for 2, that we've sort of retrofitted, figuring out how to hack sort of more traditional games into a 2-player format.
Yeah, you've done games like Dungeons and Dragons and other games that aren't originally designed for...
Yeah, we do a pretty even split of games that are made for 2 and games that are not, that we've played with 2.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and your other one I just listened to for the first time recently, and it was awesome.
That makes me really happy. I'm really proud of it. It is called All My Fantasy Children. It is a role-playing game character creation podcast in which my friend Aaron Catano and we take listener prompts and we turn them into role-playing game characters. We sort of roll them up in like various games, Dungeons and Dragons, Cyberpunk 2020, games that have a lot of tables. We roll up characters. We sort of see how all the characters interact with each other. It's a lot of fun. It's really good.
Yeah, it was tons of fun. And the one I listened to was Swiftwind, I think it was, the sword.
Ah, Swiftwind's a good one. Yeah, our fantasy superhero with a talking sword who's also like a mail carrier.
Yeah, really good one to start with. That was fantastic. Listening to you guys bounce ideas off of each other. I did an episode of the Dungeon Masters block with DM Mitch, where he wanted to kind of give an example of how a game master and a player can work together to create a character that fits within the story that you're telling. And that cooperative storytelling, just even before you've even started a game or a campaign, can be so energizing and so much fun. And I felt it all the way through that episode.
It's one of my favorite things about role-playing is that, I mean, it's collaborative storytelling all the way down, but like, even starting with like, hey, this is the idea for a character. Well, cool, what if it's like this? And then seeing where you end up and then going from there, I think is incredibly gratifying. And so I love doing that on the show.
Yeah, fantastic. So when did you first see Young Justice? Did you binge it on Netflix? Did you get it on DVDs? Did you watch it when it was originally aired? What's your take?
My wife and I watched the first episode when it aired live, and it didn't immediately grab us, and so we kind of fell off of it. Then when it was on Netflix, we had seen it recommended from a lot of different people, and we started watching it from there. We were like, let's give it another shot, and it very quickly captured our hearts, and I think we binged it in maybe a week to a month tops.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I already know, I'm going to ask you about this, but you're a DC fan already, right?
I'm a hardcore DC fan. I've been a DC fan forever, like as long as I can remember. And I really love the weird, obscure corners of the DC universe, and Young Justice really, especially in like the back half of the first season onward, they just said, let's just throw everything in. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
And so there's so many like weird cameos and stuff that it immediately captured my heart.
I mean, even as of this recording, we just aired the Downtime episode where we talk about like Starro and, like there's so much interesting stuff that they take and they give it this great twist. The whole idea of Amazo and, like Professor Ivo being weirdly geeky and super creepy at the same time. Like
they give so many things like an interesting take that are similar to how they are in the comics. Like Ivo's a good example where he's a mad scientist, but he's not like cackling mad. He's like a scientist that has gone too far. And that's just fascinating. Like it's so well written in that sense, and that they
And well acted too, because you need to have those voice actors pull it off, and they do it so well.
They do it amazingly. Yeah, it's so good. And there's so many just little tweaks. Like, we're going to talk a lot about Superman, but I love the idea that they have a Superman that is immediately unsure of what he should do. When Superboy shows up, he spends like so much of the series being like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now.
I can fight supervillains and all day long, and I know that, but yeah, we're going to talk about that.
I love it. I love it a lot.
So reading comics, like, did you grow up reading comics? Are you talking, did you become a fan through, like, say, the animated series or any of that kind of stuff? Like, where's that?
I definitely became a fan of the DC universe through the animated series. I grew up very much with the DC animated universe, the Bruce Timm cartoons. I think the first one aired, it was 95, so I would have been 7, and it ran through until I was in college. Mm-hmm. So I very much grew up with the DC animated universe. And that introduced me to a lot of stuff that I then, especially when I got into being a teenager and sort of got back into comic books.
Yeah.
I sought things out. Actually the DC animated universe, particularly Justice League, is the thing that pushed me back into comic books. Because I remember seeing the Booster Gold episode of Justice League Unlimited.
the greatest story never told, that one?
It's one of my favorite episodes ever.
Oh, Booster.
And then seeing a trade paperback of formerly known as the Justice League, which was the JLI reunion comic, in a comic shop. It had come out around the same time. So I picked that and be like, oh, hey, it's that guy that I like. And I picked it up and fell in love with all of those characters and proceeded to branch out through all of these characters of okay, Elongated Man is cool. Let me learn everything about Elongated Man.
Nice. That's crazy. That Booster Gold is your gateway. That's so funny to me.
Booster Gold is my touchstone, and it makes me so happy because he's so good.
He's so good and so bad. Both.
He's just the worst idiot, and it makes me so happy.
Well, so my first experience with your podcast, Party of One, was I had heard a bunch of people recommending it, and I'm a big fan of 2-player games. So I was like, yeah, let me give this a shot. This is a different take on an actual play. And I listened to the episode of the game Our Radios Are Dying, and yeah, I was like, oh, yeah, that was deep. For those who don't know, Our Radios Are Dying is a 2-player designed RPG, specifically, right? It's designed for 2 players.
Yeah, it's designed for 2, yeah.
Can you tell us what that game is?
Yeah, it's about 2 lesbian cosmonauts, one from Venus and one from Mars. Venus and Mars are at war. It is illegal to be queer on both planets, and it is punishable by death. It is illegal to cavort with the enemy. Both lovers are in the star-crossed romance. They've snuck away onto a space station, but then there has been an accident, and you are floating off in space with no hope of rescue. And you just have to have your final conversations and say all the things that you never got to say.
So you have 1 hour of air, and the game takes an hour, and you're literally on a timer talking through this relationship or what things. And the game, behind the scenes, you have prompts for conversation topics. And
yeah, each player has a different list of prompts. There's 2 lists of prompts, and so it's all things say something that you've never gotten to tell the other person. Tell them a way that they've disappointed you. Ask them to say I love you like they used to one last time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
It's light. It's fun. It's laughs.
Yeah, it's light. It's good fun. No, I listened to it and I was like, oof, because I'd listened to a lot of One Shot and the One Shot Podcast Network. And there's a lot of, it's improvisational actors and comedians. So it's a lot of fun, goofy, that kind of stuff. But I like the dramatic episodes. And so I listened to that and I was like, yeah, this is a good show. So I kept listening to that. And the twist really of your show is not only do you have games that are specifically designed for 2 people like Our Radios Are Dying, but you take other things that aren't designed for 2-player games and hack them, as you mentioned before, into being able to be played, which I think is a great tool to show people because you can't always get a bunch of people together, and you and your wife or your partner or you and your kid or that kind of thing may just want to sit down and play a game, which is fantastic. But so from a story, from a like a Young Justice related standpoint, have you done much in the way of the superhero themed genre? Do you have experience with any games that you've hacked or were designed on a superhero theme that can be played with 2 players?
The one real superhero game that I know we've played on the show is called, it's not out yet, but we're playtesting it on the air. It's called Project Wingspan, and it's about a country that's at war, and somebody is enlisted into a super soldier program to like fight as their big advanced like secret weapon. And it's very like Captain America. It's very cool. It's designed for 2. You're like you're fighting, but you're also fighting for like the soul of the country that you live in. It's really neat. It's a cool game.
Oh, interesting. That's so interesting. And what's your experience with superhero RPGs in general? Like, do you have a favorite system? Have you played a lot, or?
I've always been fascinated with superhero RPGs, but I've never gotten to play as many of them as I'd like. It's been something that I've spent a lot of my life reading them and being like, hey, we should play this. And people are like, eh.
Right.
But I love them because I love superheroes, and I struggle with them a lot because I think a lot of them fall into being very crunchy in a way that I don't find conducive to like superheroic stuff. But I love games that sort of aim more for the narrative thrust of it. Like, I'm a big fan of Masks. Like, Masks is pretty cool.
We've talked about Masks a lot on this show, for sure. Just as a jargon definition, when you say crunch, what do you mean? For those listeners who don't necessarily know what that means.
Sure. What I mean is that like crunch is a role-playing game term that basically means like volume of rules. Mm-hmm. Like crunchy games there's a lot of just different rules to do different things. And I am a man that I have a very low tolerance for paperwork, and I have a very low tolerance for math. So, like, a lot of superhero games are like, here's all of the powers that you can have. Here's how the rules interact with each of them.
Yeah.
Here's the different effects that can come from those powers. And, like, it just turns into a lot of, like, writing things down in advance to be like, okay, if I want to use my super speed, I have to roll this, add this. If I want to use it to punch somebody, I have to add this, this, and this. And it becomes a lot. It's not my jam when it's a whole lot of bookkeeping.
Sure. No, I get it. Do you have particular like themes of characters that you like to play? Like is a particular character type jump out at you in say Young Justice or in comics in general? You said you're a big Superman fan, so is it the alien from another planet?
In terms of Superman, if I were to play a Superman character, I would probably be less an alien and more just like an elder statesman type. Because that's always been the Superman like team dynamic that I've always really enjoyed, is Superman as the person that came first and that everybody kind of inherently like looks to and is like, okay, Superman's here, the situation is under control.
Interesting.
I also really love gadgeteer heroes, like both in sort of the older sort of pulp tradition type guys, like your Green Hornet, or not less Green Hornet, but like your sort of gadgety science heroes, your Tom Strongs and your Edisons and that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And then I also like sort of the more modern like Ted Kord, Blue Beetle type dorks.
Yeah, exactly. How do you feel about Ted in Young Justice?
I love Ted Kord a lot. I've grown okay with his death being sort of a central thing that is important.
Yeah.
Because I also love Jaime a whole ton.
Yeah.
I guess the only time I get salty about Ted Kord's death is when it's not used in that way.
Right.
Like when the New 52 rebooted Jaime and they were just like, yep, nope, Ted Kord never happened. He just sort of found this thing. It's like, no.
Oh, really? They erased Ted Kord out of 52?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't
New 52,
know that.
He just wasn't a thing.
Oh, that's not cool.
Real salty about that.
Yeah, no, I can
real salty about that.
Man, I kind of like want to veer off onto Ted Kord for a while, but let's stay on track here because I wanted to have you on the show because when we decided we were going to have this show and we were talking about it on Twitter, like you jumped in and started spouting all kinds of Superman lore and the Jack Kirby, what's referred to as the fourth world Jack Kirby Apocalypse, New Genesis storyline
love
stuff. And
Love it a lot.
I know some people who are some pretty big fans, but like you have a passion for this material. To some watchers who we've spoken to, it's a bit of an odd take. Not like an odd take, like when you get to those episodes with the Infinite Man or Infinity Man,
Yeah,
in the
Infinity
second
Man,
season,
the Forever People, yeah.
yeah, and or in the first season, I'm sorry, and you get Sphere, and you get these things, and there's certain quirky things about those episodes. Of course, what we refer to as Kirby tech, that kind of art style, but also little things like the fact that Sphere, once it's in the supercycle form, always hovers at a very steep angle.
Yeah.
Right? And it looks odd, except if you know Jack Kirby's style, like it's clearly a nod to how Jack did his thing.
Things are one of the things I love about Jack Kirby's stuff, his art style, is that nothing is ever presented straight. Like nothing is ever no one is ever standing still and talking.
Yeah.
They're always striking a pose, and they're pointing, and they're yelling, and there's a lot of bold capital letters text, and it's good. It's cool.
Well, what's funny is people look at that and they're like, "Oh, it's so over the top. It's so, not subtle." Blah. I'm like, guys, you have no idea what we're talking about here. Jack Kirby changed comics forever. There's a reason why Jack Kirby, he wrote for DC Comics, he wrote for Marvel, he was a key creator of so many major characters. But the reason is because up until Jack Kirby, comics were fairly stagnant.
Jack Kirby, he does so much to revolutionize. Like, the superhero iconography is indebted to Jack Kirby's frenetic designs.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, everything was like the old Sunday comics where it was just a lot of talking heads and maybe a punch, thrown. But like with Jack Kirby, it was like he was drawing, like jumping off of a page at you. And it was a little over the top, but it's like he was swinging the pendulum in the other way in such a critical way that was a springboard for how we view comics today.
The thing that always resonates with me about like how over the top Kirby stuff is fundamentally speaking, it's an over the top or medium or art form or themes, however you want to describe superheroes, they're an over the top concept. I don't think there's any reason to present them in another, or rather, there are definitely stories that are served better by a subtler touch, but in sort of that conventional, like, good guys fight bad guys and punch each other, like, that's such an operatic, big, over-the-top thing that I think, like, that sense of dynamism and movement is just, it fits. And it's so, especially when Jack Kirby is just throwing things at a wall and just being like, yep, just putting it out there, like, that sense of big, bold action is critical.
I mean, key creator for characters like Captain America and Galactus, like these, particularly like Galactus, these giant, like over the top, huge, literally gigantic characters. And then the fourth world is just, I don't know.
It's all that. It's if Galactus was just one of the characters. It's a whole book of just Galactuses.
Right? Yeah, it's nuts. And the key, the DC Comics standard universe that gets the fourth world kind of gets plugged into so regularly, the vector in which the fourth world gets introduced to the standard DC universe is almost inevitably Superman on a regular basis. And you have a big love for Superman as well. So,
I do.
And unfortunately, like, he's a hero that notoriously gets a bad rap and has lots of issues. Or people say he has a lot of issues. I've been on my soapbox a lot on the show talking about my frustration with people saying you can't tell a good Superman story. Where does your love of Superman come from? Like, where does that start?
When I was younger, in my teenage years, I was definitely in the Superman is boring, Superman is overly powerful, Superman is overly good. I was that kid when I was 15. But I think probably by the time I got to college, Justice League Unlimited and All-Star Superman were happening around the same time, maybe give or take a few years, or like a year or two. But between those two things, it kind of clicked. I was like, oh, I get it. Yep. Between Justice League Unlimited, there's sort of two famous like Superman moments where one of them, I think somebody insults him for getting hit and getting knocked out a bunch, and he just doesn't miss a beat, and he says,
"Hot girl.
Every hit that I take, somebody else doesn't."
Yep.
And I'm like, oh, that's unbelievably cool. And then there's that monologue that he gives Darkseid in the final episode when he says I live in a world of cardboard. Like, I live my life under complete control because if I don't, somebody gets hurt. And like hearing that, and then also kind of getting the exact opposite experience in All-Star Superman, where it feels like there's no, like, I remember seeing those episodes and then seeing the very specific piece of promotional art that they put out for All-Star Superman, where I think it's the cover to maybe the first issue, where it's Superman just sitting on a cloud looking back at you and smiling. And I was like, and it's the most peaceful, serene image imaginable. And being like, oh, now I get it. It's somebody that is so powerful that, like, he has to be above all, like, human concern, or else he would lose his mind. And it's this beautiful sense of being all powerful, but not only not being corrupted, but being sort of free from concern and being free to pursue good for goodness sake, because you don't have to worry about limits.
Yeah.
And like, as I kind of realized all of those things, I was like, I kind of fell in love. Then I started to go back through, and I learned about like the history of Siegel and Schuster, and like why they created the character, and all the different iterations from there. And it was just, it's a fascinating journey to go on to like study the life and times of Superman.
Interesting. Did you ever read Kurt Busiek's Astro City?
I have read bits of Astro City, and I love what I've read, but I've never actually gotten to like sit down and read the whole series cover to cover.
The very first issue is almost exactly, it's like the sole argument against not being able to tell a good Superman story. Astro City is not in the DC universe, and this character is not Superman, but it's clearly a Superman analog. He's an alien from another planet who's a reporter and blah, blah, blah. Like, they they don't even hide it. But the story starts with him basically saying, what do I dream about? I dream about flying. And you're like, what? Like, why would Superman dream about flying? And then he takes you through his day about how he has to fly from, you know, Washington, D.C. to Tokyo to stop a volcano and then fly into space to stop an asteroid and to fly all these, you know, everywhere to do all these things and whatever. And he never just gets to be. Like, he has to be everywhere at the planet at the same time to save everyone all the time. And he never gets to just fly to enjoy it. And it's such this poignant, like almost heartbreaking tale of what it's like to be him. I love it. I think you'd really appreciate it.
I love that. I'm gonna have to look that up. I love that. One of the things I love about Superman is that, like, he does all of these things, but yet he also does have time to, like, because I've always loved the Superman stories that are like, Superman is gonna hang out with Lois Lane and they're gonna make dinner together, and it's the fact that he is always Clark Kent is something else that speaks to me. It's kind of ironic because he's such a sort of, on one hand, very simplistic and idealistic, but it's a very adult concept, is the idea of choosing to accept a responsibility because you have the ability to do good, as opposed to something like Batman, where he is sort of put into this position almost against his will, and he sort of is reactive. I've always kind of liked the idea that Superman's justification is not, well, I have to do this to avenge something. I have to do this because I am mad at someone. He says, I am doing this because I have the tools and the capabilities to help people. Therefore, it is my responsibility to help people. That's, it's an unabashedly idealistic idea, but it's also the idea of making that choice to do good because you have the ability is sort of maturity in a nutshell. Is like altruism and maturity in a core idea.
I love it. So I grew up on comics in general, but DC specifically, and I feel like characters like Superman helped to create my own moral code.
Oh, very much so. I feel the same way.
In that way, like you're saying, like, is it like childish or overly idealistic to choose to do good? Like to be compassionate or to do things for the sake of just being good? Why is that a bad character trait, and why can't you tell good stories about it wrapped around it?
I feel exactly the same way, Rich. Like I ask myself that question a lot because Superman is somebody that is as a character and as a collection of traits is a thing that in exactly the same way. It defines a lot of how I like think about life. It informs a lot of how I think about the world. Is like you help people and you are kind not because you're going to get something out of it, but because it's good to be good and kind.
Yeah.
Like, it's sort of the beauty of Superman as a character to me is that he represents not what we are, but what we can aspire to be.
Yeah.
You know, we may not all be 100% good all the time, but Superman represents the ideal that there are ways that we can help people, and there are ways that we can save the day, and we can choose to do those not because we were wronged or not because it is our ordained responsibility, but just because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps me coming back to Superman, is seeing this idea of doing good for goodness sake.
Yeah.
It's also what drives me to Santa Claus, in case you were wondering. Just putting that out there.
Because at the time of this recording, it's getting close to Christmas here, and I've heard you say that at least twice now so far. But yes. Do you remember the Justice League Unlimited episode called Clash?
Oh, when he fights Captain Marvel, yeah.
Yeah, that it's a good episode. It's probably one of my favorite Justice League animated episodes. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because Billy Batson as a character, like when Shazam calls out Superman for not being hero enough, that final speech he gives is so heartbreaking because it's coming from a 10-year-old who has looked up to the Justice League and is now part of them and sees behind the scenes of how his heroes may not quite be the heroes that he thinks they are.
Yeah.
Yet still, Superman is a huge heroic character in the animated series, yet somehow even there, I don't know. Like, it's such a good episode. It's so good.
It is, and I think that it kind of touches on, in my opinion, what the core of a great Superman story is. The core of a great Superman story, in my humble and not so humble opinion, is not whether or not Superman will survive a threat. And I think that's where a lot of people say, oh, well, Superman stories are boring because we know that he's going to survive. And I take issue with that because we know that Batman is going to survive those same stories.
Yes, we do.
And I think that the challenge of a great Superman story is not approaching it with a mindset of will Superman survive or not. It's approaching it with a mindset of will Superman's morals and like moral compass survive intact. And I think that's what's beautiful about the Clash is like Superman is put in a position where his morals don't. And that's what makes it a failure. It's not whether or not he can beat Captain Marvel in a fight. It's whether or not he can take Lex Luthor's humanitarianism at face value. And he can't. His morals fail, and that's where he fails.
Yes, and that is it. That you've hit the nail on the head, my friend. That is exactly what that episode is about. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it a great episode and a great Superman story. Absolutely.
That's also what makes Man of Steel a bad movie, in my opinion, is it's fundamentally not a film that engages a sense, because it's a Superman without that moral code, and therefore the challenge of will Superman's moral code survive, it means nothing. It means nothing when he snaps Zod's neck, because his whole story up to that point has been maybe that busload of kids should die. And it's like, okay, but that's not...
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan now you're a nightmare, Kent. I don't know what is up with his dad in that movie. It drives me crazy.
Real frustrating.
Real frustrating. And to compare it to the Jonathan Kent of, say, again, just to pick a random show, Young Justice, where in the second season where they have the Green Beetle and they bring him back to, the Kent farm because they don't have anywhere else to take him. They don't know where to take him. And Jonathan Kent's like, we've had weirder things than him in this barn. And any excuse to see one of my boys. And he's referring to Superboy because he has accepted him as family. And you look at that and it's like, yes, this is where, who just said this morning? It may have been Roy Westerman. He's the guy who created the Earth 27 project. And he was saying that Jonathan Kent is the man in Superman. Where
very much so.
Jor-El is the super part of Superman.
Yeah.
Like, those are the two pieces that come together to help Clark be who he is, right?
Yes.
And to remove Jonathan by killing him always bothers me. But to make it even worse by, like, having him say, like, yeah, those busload of kids should die, just basically removes the heart of the entire character of Superman to the point where you don't know what you're talking about.
Yes, very much so. One of the things that really speaks to me about Superman is that Superman is, in a lot of ways, he's the ultimate immigrant story, as he is someone that comes from another place with a set of skills and finds a place in our society and then thrives. And the society itself is elevated by his presence. It is the ultimate, like I said previously, it's the ultimate growing up story in that somebody says, I can do good, therefore let me do good. But I think the piece of the puzzle that really frustrates me about Man of Steel's treatment of Jonathan Kent, especially in regards to the animated portrayals, is I think it's also the ultimate adoption story, in that he is taken in by a family that he is made to be a better person, because though he is not with his birth family, he finds what ultimately becomes his true family, and and they raise him with values, and he becomes a better person. He finds his place in a new environment. And I think making Jonathan Kent not inherently good I think there's some interesting things there, but I think you lose part of what makes Superman Superman, is that he's not, you lose something. And I would also point out, the Young Justice Jonathan Kent is great. There's also one of my favorite moments in Justice League Unlimited is when it's the Christmas episode, it's Comfort and Joy, when they bring Martian Manhunter.
When Martian Manhunter comes back home with Clark. Yeah.
And he's like, hey, this is John. And they both go, yeah, we're kind of used to aliens. Come on in. And they give him a sweater.
They give him the sweater, the turtleneck sweater.
And it's really one of my favorite Superman moments ever is when Martha and John Kent both say, yeah, we used to have to wrap our presents in lead so that Clark wouldn't be able to see him. And he goes,
wouldn't peek.
He's got a mug of cocoa to his face and he goes, you mean Santa wrapped him in lead? And he takes a sip and they're just like, yes, dear Santa Claus. And later in the episode, we just get a half-second shot of Clark Kent looking real closely at a gift and then lead.
Exactly.
I love the Kents.
Thank you.
I love the Kents a lot.
Thank you. Now, I defend Superman a lot on the show, and I can't call myself the biggest Superman fan. I like Superman. I learned to read on Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. So that era of Superboy where he's kind of a late teen, that character really sits with me. And I enjoy Superman as a character. He's not ever been my favorite DC hero, but I know a lot about him, and I don't think that it's fair, as we've discussed, to say that you can't tell a good story. I think you've given some great examples about how that's irrelevant. But one of the things, like we were saying, that's tied in so tightly with Superman is this enmity with, like, Darkseid and the Planet of Apocalypse and New Genesis and that whole, like, spin-off thing. And you've mentioned your love of that to me specifically, but all of that myth ties in so heavily into Young Justice, like starting with the episode Bereft, where you have the boom tube test and they drop the sphere into the desert, and then all the way through to the end of the season 2 finale, where we literally see Darkseid, who has been planning these things the whole time, like it's such an influence on what's going on with the light, and now we're going to get to hopefully see what that is in the third season. Mm-hmm. What is it about the fourth world that gets to you? Like, why is that niche so intriguing to you?
There's a lot of reasons, and I wanted to, it's funny that you mentioned Bereft, because really, if you look at the Fourth World saga, and you go all the way back through it, in my research for this episode, I realized this. In the first ever DC book that Jack Kirby writes when he leaves Marvel in the late 60s, early 70s, the first book that he writes, which is, I wrote it down, Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen 133. Do you know what he creates in that first issue? Project Cadmus. So it literally...
No way. That's the first appearance is in Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen?
Going into the answering the question as to what I like about the Fourth World, and one of the answers is the behind the scenes of it is fascinating. So much of it is tied up with Jack Kirby as a person, then that's part of what makes it so special. Because the origins of the Fourth World is Jack Kirby leaves Marvel. He leaves Marvel, he is not happy. They've not treated him well, he departs, he goes to DC. He goes to the distinguished competition, so to speak. He goes there and says, "What's your lowest selling book?" Because he doesn't want to knock anybody, he doesn't want to take anybody's job, because like he saw that happen at Marvel. So he says, "What's your lowest selling book? Like, put me on that." And they say, "Their lowest selling book is Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen." So he says, "All right, let's do this."
Oh my god, that's fantastic.
And in his first issue, he creates Project Cadmus and starts seeding Fourth World concepts. So one of the things that I love about Young Justice is that they are literally seeding Fourth World concepts from episode 1, almost scene 1, when we get introduced to like the Guardian and Project Cadmus. It's all like Kirby stuff that's just being dropped in and just building to that moment when Darkseid steps on screen.
Wow, amazing. I did not know Cadmus was... You blowed my mind. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's real cool.
I don't even know what to say. Keep talking about Fourth World. I gotta process.
So the Fourth World is, obviously, it's Jack Kirby's magnum opus. It is the most purely Jack Kirby thing in a career of extremely Jack Kirby things. And as a Jack Kirby fan, that is kind of what I love about it in a nutshell. Like I mentioned, it is his return to DC Comics. He had done some work with them earlier, like when he created the Manhattan Guardian. He'd done some work with them previously. He's come back. He has left Marvel after creating the Marvel Age. He left. It was a huge, big thing. And he goes and he starts working on Jimmy Olsen. He starts introducing all these concepts. And he very quickly creates something that kind of has never been done in comics before at this moment. He creates, like, it's essentially creating the event comic, where it's a bunch of different comics that are going to come together and tell one cohesive story, each one focusing on an individual group and how they tie in. So he essentially creates the event comic. And it is this huge, spanning thing, this cosmic war between good and evil, between free will and choice, and between light and darkness, and hope and despair. And it's just, like, if you'll indulge me.
Please.
I would like to read to you the opening monologue, or the opening lines to The New Gods, Issue 1. Epilogue. There came a time when the old gods died. The brave died with the cunning. The noble perished, locked in battle with unleashed evil. For it was the last day for them. An ancient era was passing in fiery holocaust.
Wow.
First off, zero chill, and that is amazing. That's Jack Kirby in a nutshell, where it's like, there's no subtlety. No. It's not like, well, let's see, there's a lot of intrigue.
Right.
There came a time when the old gods died. And this is a full-page spread of the old gods murdering each other. And it's like 3 pages of, like, the world destroying itself. And along the same lines of saying, like, it's everything in it is sort of inextricably tied to Jack Kirby. It's impossible to talk about all these things without pointing out stuff like the time and place of it all, because Jack Kirby has just left Marvel. Jack Kirby has just gone to DC. What's one of Jack Kirby's most, like, biggest, most famous creations at Marvel is the world of Thor and Asgard, the old Norse gods. So he walks into the DC office and essentially says to the fan base, guess what? All that stuff that you love, dead. You ain't seen nothing yet. He blows it all up. If you look in the artwork for, like, the first few pages of the New Gods 1, do you see, like, references to different Asgard characters? Like, their headgear is, like, scattered about. Like, he is not making it subtle about the fact that he's like, yeah, you know me from Thor. I'm blowing it all to hell. We're starting over. Sci-fi gods now. These are mine.
Wow. That's fantastic.
He's created this big cosmic operatic thing, which in a nutshell, out of the old world, the world of the old gods, which is never fully clarified, but we all kind of know what it is. Right. Outspin these two planets, Apocalypse, which is pure evil and hopelessness, and New Genesis, which is purely good and light. To prevent that kind of war that destroyed the Third World, the two armies make a pact. They trade sons, Darkseid and Highfather, lords of Apocalypse and New Genesis respectively, swap sons in a peace treaty. Orion, son of Darkseid, grows up on New Genesis, surrounded by hope and light, and becomes, while he is still racked by his, like, evil nature, he becomes a force for good. Meanwhile, Scott Free, son of Highfather, is not raised by Darkseid, but rather by Granny Goodness, who is a demented old angry lady who sounds like Ed Asner, because that is the only casting choice I've
voice ever.
She's a demented old lady that puts him essentially in a series of torture chambers for his entire upbringing, because she wants to break his will. In response to this, Scott Free becomes the galaxy's greatest escape artist, and the only person to ever leave Apocalypse alive, by choice. So, in addition to the fact that it is a grand, sweeping, superheroic cosmic war opera, it is also fundamentally a story about how evil cannot triumph as long as there is hope, but light can redeem darkness, but darkness can never fully trample light as long as light maintains hope. So, and that is, like, the most fundamentally superheroic concept imaginable. Like, that's superheroes in a nutshell, is like, evil can be redeemed, but good can never fully be extinguished. Like, that's beautiful. Like, that's unbelievably beautiful.
Wow, man. I mean, I enjoy the Fourth World stuff and the Fourth World stories, but you have taken this to a whole new place for me as a level of respect.
Oh, I love them. I love them a lot.
I'm so glad you came on the show to tell us this story, because I've never heard that story.
Yeah, that's like
amazing.
It's so good. It's so good.
So did you get introduced to the Fourth World stuff through the comics then? Like,
I actually got introduced to them through the Superman cartoon, which did
of course.
The animated series did a lot of the Fourth World stuff. They introduced a lot of those characters.
That whole bit at the end of the Superman the Animated Series where Clark is his weapon, is Darkseid's weapon.
And that informs everything that happens in Justice League Unlimited. But yeah, they introduce Darkseid and they introduce the Fourth World stuff. They go into a lot of it. They introduce Orion. I think Mr. Miracle might show up at some point or another.
Oh yeah, you know what? I was just talking to Cat Cool. We were bringing up that great episode. We were talking about the Wally West Flash actually, and we were bringing up that fantastic episode with Orion and Batman with the Flash Museum.
Yes, one of the greatest moments in any superhero medium is when he goes to the Trickster and he's like, "You're off your medicine," and Trickster's like, "Oh no, I'm fine. I don't need it." And he's like, "Go, you know, I will visit you." And he's like,
"Turn yourself in when you get done with your drink."
Got me again, Flash. Oh, it makes me cry every time, and it's like it's beautiful.
I know, it's so good. And of course, you got Mark Hamill doing trickster voice, which is always amazing.
They draw him to look like Mark Hamill from the Flash TV show. It's so good.
I know, it's so good. Anyway, sorry I derailed you a little bit, but
no, it's fine. The Fourth World is, in my opinion, superhero fiction boiled down into like its purest concept, and then expanded back out across the entire cosmos. Also, not for nothing, but it also includes in my all-time favorite romance in any fictional medium ever, which is the love story between Mr. Miracle and Big Barda.
Right. Mr. Miracle being Scott Free, the character.
Scott Free becomes Mr. Miracle, the world's greatest escape artist. When he launches his final escape from Apocalypse, he breaks through everything. But in doing so, he is almost captured by one of Darkseid's female Furies, who are women that are raised to be warriors from birth. Big Barda almost captures him, but the two of them fall in love. She helps him escape, accompanies him to Earth. The two of them protect one another from Darkseid's forces, and fall in love, get married, and in one of the greatest bizarre moments of comic book history, they get married, Darkseid shows up, and says, I might be evil, but I can't disrupt a wedding.
What?
And then just leaves. It's just like, bye. Can't disrupt a wedding. Nothing I can do. And then just leaves. And they have a happy ending. They get married. They move in together. They spend the 90s trying to be like a sitcom couple, but they don't get it because they're aliens.
They spend the 90s. I like that. I love it.
It's so... they're the 90s Mr. Miracle series where him and Big Barda, like... It spins out of Justice League International, which is another book that I deeply love. They try to get out of being superheroes. They try to leave it behind and just become like an ordinary sitcom couple. But they're both aliens, and like the Fourth World keeps tracking them down, so they keep demolishing their suburban households. And it's my favorite.
Nice. So because it has so much influence, this material has so much influence on Young Justice, subtly and overtly. Mm-hmm. What are you looking for in season 3? Like, it's been building up for 2 full seasons, and now I thought it was, the first few episodes it finally got introduced, but you're letting me know that no, it's basically Jack Kirby's had an influence since episode 1.
It's the whole time they've been building to that. And it's so funny because I remember watching the first episode, they bring up Cadmus and they introduce the Guardian, and Jen being another huge Jack Kirby fan, we're both like, We were like, I distinctly remember us both saying like, I think we're going to sit Young Justice out, but then if Darkseid shows up, we'll probably get back into it. And sure enough, it shows up on Netflix, or rather it was like if Fourth World stuff starts showing up, and then on Tumblr and Twitter we started seeing things about like, Jack Kirby stuff shows up, we're both like, yeah, we're going to get into Young Justice. This is happening.
Nice. Yeah, I don't even know what to say. Like, so all of this plotting and planning has been happening,
yes.
Right? They've been dropping apocalyptic weapons onto Earth. You've got the, what's the name of the, Ugly Mannheim works for that mob organization,
Intergang.
And that's a classic Superman stories.
Is Gordon Godfrey in... I watched it last summer, so I don't entirely remember. Gordon Godfrey is in Young Justice, right?
Yeah, Glorious Godfrey.
Yeah.
It's funny because, again, I was having this, our first discussion session was with Darcy Ross, and she was like, I love the idea of Godfrey being this human being who, is giving us this view about how normal humans view the alien invasion. And toward the end of that episode, I was like, yeah, he's not human, right? And she was like, what?
Yep.
And I think a lot of people miss that because we don't get a direct answer to that, with the exception of the fact that at the very end, in the finale of season 2, when Savage is shaking Darkseid's hand, you see Glorious Godfrey in the background, right? Mm-hmm. Still in his suit. So we don't get any answers to that yet. We just get a hint.
Actually, that's another thing I love about the Fourth World saga is, like I said about how it's inherently tied to Jack Kirby. There's a million things that tie it to Jack Kirby, Jewish American artist, war veteran, growing up in or living in the 70s in like, you know, there's so many like, so like he has the talk news person as of like the talk news radio personality as a supervillain. There's this whole thing about like indoctrinated child soldiers that's going on with Mr. Miracle. It is this really rich 70s like thing. And the way that I lovingly describe it is a swirling mass of all the things Jack Kirby is thinking about at any moment, thrown onto the page and then not thought about again. Like Don Rickles shows up, he's just in it. Don Rickles is just a character in the New Gods. There is an extended subplot with a character named Funky Flashman that is just Jack Kirby insulting Stan Lee because he's mad at him.
What?
It's so good.
And I think they're definitely like in having some new fans watching the show and chatting with us on Twitter, they're like, we don't understand what is happening with this Infinity Man and the cowboy, you know, character who wants to, they're like, this is the silliness of DC Comics that turns us off of DC Comics, right? I had one watcher say that, and I'm like, you got to know a little more about, you don't have to, but you need to be patient. Like, this stuff is going to make sense. And the amount of love that the writers have put into this show tell me that they're going to take these characters to new and interesting places.
Yes, very much so.
I think. And I think honoring like the history of what you're talking about with Jack Kirby in this episode, I am hoping will get people excited and up to speed about having Darkseid and in the third season. There's so much to love.
I think that's what I would say I want from season 3 is embrace, modernize, explain, and contextualize like we spent 2 seasons building up to the New Gods and the Fourth World, the War of the Fourth World. I think that's a season right there is like now they have to deal with Darkseid and with Desaad. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity, and the writers of Young Justice and the voice talent, everyone, has done a tremendous job of modernizing all of these things and like contextualizing them and making hard to accept things not as hard to accept. So I think if they have a whole season, they can like, you know, explain stuff like the Infinity Man or the Forever People
right.
I think that's what I would like is like for the Fourth World stuff to be the thrust of the season, like it really feels like it was building up to be.
Yeah.
And to have it done in a way that honors like the legacy and the creations of Jack Kirby, but also presents it in a way that appeals to a modern audience in the same way that the original stuff appealed to a 70s audience.
Yeah.
Also, I would like to see Mr. Miracle and Big Barda show up because I'm emotional about
my
them.
gosh, I would also like to do that as well. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add, Jeff, as we wrap up the show?
I'm real excited that it's coming back because I distinctly remember coming to it because I watched it in summer of 2015. So how long had it been off the air at that point?
A couple of years. Yeah. It was weird because their time frame stretched out. So it was 2 seasons, but it was basically 3 years, 3 years. Yeah.
I remember watching it years after it wrapped and being angry, but being angry after everyone else had already gone through it and being like, Darkseid, why'd they cancel? No! And then being like, everybody else being like, yeah, that happened 2 years ago. Did you not? Did you miss the memo? I'm like, yes, I did. I did miss the memo.
Yeah, I can't believe the timing of our show was freakish, actually, because we'd only had a couple of episodes out of our show when the announcement happened. And so obviously we couldn't be happier, but I'm really excited that you came on the show to give us this great history and background behind this story and subplot / through line for seasons that I really hope get people excited about what's potentially to come.
I hope so too. That was the other thing I was going to add was that I'm always going to fondly remember how I found out because I remember finding out that Young Justice Season 3 was happening through 2 things essentially immediately. It was you tweeting about it, and then it was about about maybe a dozen different people that I follow on Twitter tweeting it with some variation of, "Hey Rich, did you see this? By the way, that I don't know if you saw this." Me just being scrolling through Twitter, being
my phone exploded that day.
Being this is I was so full of joy of learning that and being yep, this is great.
Well, thank you so much for coming by and spending some time with us.
Of course.
In the cave,
thank you for
Jeff.
having me. This was great.
Where can people find you on Earth Prime?
People can find me on Twitter at Party of One Pod. You can find the show at soundcloud.com/partyofonepodcast. You can find All My Fantasy Children on Twitter at AMFC_podcast or on SoundCloud at All My Fantasy Children. And that's pretty much the best places to find me.
Fantastic.
Conclude Part 1. Initiate Part 2.
Today in the Watchtower, we welcome back Jeff Stormer. Jeff is the host of the actual play podcast Party of One and the world-building brainstorm podcast All My Fantasy Children. Each week, All My Fantasy Children brings Jeff together with Aaron Catano-Saez as they take a listener prompt and transform that prompt into a living, breathing character that adds to the world and drives their cooperative narrative forward. Every time I listen, I walk away with new tools in both my improv and creative writing toolbox. Jeff, I've been waiting for this conversation since we had our last conversation, so welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've been waiting with bated breath to come back on Whelmed. I think you know exactly how much I love talking about all of the things that we're going to talk about.
I have no idea.
I am pumped.
Prove it to me.
I'm going to prove it to you.
Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that our discussion episodes draw on anything and everything related to Young Justice, including both seasons of the series so far, the comics, and the video game. If you've not seen, read, or played all the material and are spoiler wary, consider this your warning. And with all that out of the way, let's dive in. So, Jeff, we talked a little bit about the things that you do, and I touched on a bit of it in the intro. We've talked about it in the last podcast. Why don't you just give a brief kind of overview of what you do for those listeners who may not have heard our previous discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I am the host of Party of One, which is an actual play RPG podcast focused on two-player role-playing games. So every week I sit down with a guest one-on-one, and we play through a short, self-contained tabletop RPG session. Basically, if you take a full game of Dungeons and Dragons and it's just two people, that's Party of One in a nutshell.
I have to jump in here and interrupt you for a second. We're going to be talking about some old school comics and some old school characters. If you're into kind of the old school Crypt Keeper horror style comics, I cannot recommend the recently released Jeff and Vegas Lancaster. What was the name of the game that you guys were playing?
Stories from the Grave.
Stories from the Grave. They're two short stories games that they played, and the first one was freaking brilliant. It was brilliant.
It's real good.
It's real good. Vegas Lancaster is real good, guys. So go check that one out if you're looking for something to check out on Party of One. It's short. The first one's short, and then they have two of them, so you can get a 2-for-1.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good episode. I loved playing. That game is so much fun, and it really captures that feel of if you like old school Crypt Keeper horror comics, it really captures that kind of feel.
It felt like a Twilight Zone episode.
Yep.
I felt so bad for Vegas.
Oh man, I felt terrible for Vegas. Because the cool thing about that game is the thing that I like about Crypt Keeper style horror comics is they're often specifically about bad people getting their horrible comeuppance. And the thing that was fun about the game that Vegas and I played was at no point is he a bad person.
No.
And so I'm doing this horrible thing to him that I don't want to spoil too much about.
No. He kept trying to stop it from happening, and it just wasn't working.
And it just wouldn't happen. Which is actually my favorite thing about that episode. The short version is he gets a mysterious LARP that turns out evil.
Right.
It's evil LARP.
A LARP is a live-action role-playing game where you probably have seen people at conventions or out in various cities where they're actually playing the characters out in the real world for various reasons. So he gets this LARP to play with his friends, this mysterious European LARP. Mm-hmm. And it goes well. It all goes well.
Yeah, it all goes great. And, mysterious things start happening, and he keeps trying to stop them from happening.
Right.
And the thing that I love about it is there's a little bit of magic, but a lot of it is just people
being people.
People being people and being like, hey, I did a thing I wasn't supposed to. I didn't mean to. It just kind of happened.
Right.
And it just keeps spiraling for that reason. That's why I love that particular game.
Anyway, check that one out. And then all my fantasy children, man, amazing.
Oh, it's so good. All My Fantasy Children is a character creation, world building, and storytelling podcast powered by listener prompts. The way it works is Aaron Gaetano, Saez, and I, the two of us have been best friends since childhood. Every week we take a listener prompt given to us via email, Twitter, Facebook, Discord, whatever. And we, using some of our favorite role-playing games or supplements and just a lot of conversation and world-building questions, we spin them into a character not unlike, we say a role-playing game character, but oftentimes like an NPC or a part of this fictional world that we've been building. And it's good. It is just a lot of improv and storytelling and world building and collaborative, generation of things.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that this is not for like a system of any kind. It's really, to me, feels like, even though I'm a role player, of course I'm looking at it from a role playing and perspective, but I'm also a writer, and it's really a writing podcast. It's about how to do collaborative work together, no matter what that happens to be. Hearing you and Aaron bouncing ideas off of each other, so much yes and, right? Or no but, going on, that's really driving this creative process where sometimes you get these bonkers prompts, and what comes out the other side, 9 times out of 10, it's blowing me away. Like, it's amazing. And then you don't just take the character and have it exist in a vacuum. You plug it into this world that you've been slowly creating that you just generically call the fantasy, right? And that you're building this, you're using the characters to build the world as well as the world to inform the characters. And I think that's a really important and interesting skill to have if you're a writer or a creator, to realize that your characters do not exist in a vacuum and the world does not exist without the characters being involved in it.
And it's funny that you mentioned that and bring it up, because it's also, this is a little bit of a segue into talking about like superheroes and superhero comics, but like that is something that I definitely took from superhero comics, is the idea that no one's story is 100%, in a superhero universe, no one's story is 100% a vacuum. Right. There's always that chance that there's going to be a crossover, or that like in the sort of grand Marvel Comics tradition of like New York being the place where everyone is, even if there's not a full crossover, there's still a chance that you might see Tony Stark's face on a billboard.
Right.
It's that idea that like everyone kind of exists in the same place. So understanding like, okay, well, yeah, then this has to kind of overlap with what's happening over here is sort of just naturally part of that process.
Yeah, I totally hear you, and I totally agree. So in our last chat, you took me to school on comics legend Jack Kirby, on the incredible history of the Fourth World as a creation, and pretty much changed how I view Superman for the rest of my life. So no pressure on today's episode.
We're going to keep it light. It'll be fun.
It'll be fun. Because you started watching Young Justice, you watched it and then you didn't, and then you heard that Jack Kirby stuff was coming up left and right, and then you decided to revisit it, right? That was kind of your original Young Justice watching story, right?
Yeah. We watched the first episode, maybe 2 episodes, and kind of like fell off of it. It just didn't grab us. It didn't grab my partner and I. We had kind of watched it. We were coming off of Justice League Unlimited, and I wasn't ready to put my heart out there again. I understand. It had big shoes to fill. Right. And so we kind of like backed off of it, and then we'd heard that like there was a lot of Kirby stuff, and we're both huge fans of the Fourth World. And so we had said, let's give this a try, and immediately hooked. Like it was just hook, line, and sinker from the go on our second try.
I love it. Well, one of the things you mentioned in our last conversation was your love for Ted Kord, a.k.a. the previous second Blue Beetle before Jaime. And Ted gets mentioned a couple times in season 2, obviously in relation to Jaime. And he gets mentioned in the Young Justice tie-in comics as well. And we know that Superboy knew him, felt like he was a good man. He looked kind of upset when Jaime was talking about him, that he had died, and like felt bad about it. But that's basically all we get. We know that he was a genius, and that I think Jaime says, I heard he was a genius or something. And that he had the Ted Cord Industries, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much all we get. So let's dive into Ted Cord.
Let's do it. I'm so excited.
Because I'm wondering, I want to know if more Ted comes up in the future, particularly if Booster Gold ends up showing up. And
I have a lot of thoughts about if Booster Gold shows up. I have a lot of thoughts. They've had a lot of thoughts for a long time. We'll get there.
Let's start with Ted. So let's start with Ted. Let's talk about the history of Ted and the character of Blue Beetle as well. So as of this recording, we had just released our comic commentary episode covering issues 9 and 10, I believe, in which I do a mini Secret Origins on Captain Atom. I bring that up because, like Captain Atom, Blue Beetle was also a character acquired by DC from Charlton Comics, right? They were both Charlton Comics characters?
Yes. Ted Cord was a pure Charlton Comics character, and Blue Beetle is a carryover from a company called Fox Comics. Dan Garrett, the first Blue Beetle. One of the things I like about Blue Beetle, is a side note for right off the start, is he is a legacy hero before legacy heroes were really a thing. A lot of the idea of like what makes a legacy hero starts with the Blue Beetle. Even before you get into like the Batman and Robin stuff, like when Robin was kind of just going to be Robin forever, Blue Beetle was already going through a lot of this like carrying the mantle.
Right, yeah. Interesting.
So the first Blue Beetle is a guy named Dan Garrett, who is, depending on the comic that you read, either a cop or an archaeologist.
Right.
It goes back and forth.
He's an action archaeologist. He's an
action archaeologist or an archaeology cop.
Right.
Where it's a little vague.
It's like Axe Cop, but just
exactly.
Right.
And he was a comics character and a radio figure in the 40s. And as Charlton Comics like buys the rights from Fox Comics, which is I think when he changes from a cop into an archaeologist, they give him a magical amulet in the shape of a beetle that when he says the words Kajida, the amulet gives him super strength and lasers and a few other generic powers. In that kind of way that 40 superheroes sort of just had whatever power they needed. Right. He just kind of had that.
Right, exactly. Plot powered by plot.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Dan Garrett, this is a strange side story. So when my daughter was little, she just never slept. So we did a lot of walking in the stroller with her to get her to sleep. Mm-hmm. And while I was doing that, I had discovered a website called Old Time Radio and had downloaded a ton of the original Blue Beetle radio show and listened to it. And in that, Dan Garrett's a cop, and he becomes, Blue Beetle because he's wearing just like a bulletproof suit of chainmail. That's pretty much all he's got. He's a cop, and he's kind of bulletproof, and that's pretty much his thing. And since then, actually, as of this morning, when I was researching this episode, there is an Old Time Radio app that you can download that has a ton, thousands of episodes of Old Time Radio. Unfortunately, I don't think it has Blue Beetle on it. I haven't been able to find it yet, but it's got like 500 episodes of Lone Ranger and all the original Superman radio show stuff that we were talking about last time and all that kind of stuff. So if you don't want to try and track down the old comics, you can actually just download this app or go to the website. They're all open source now because it's been so long. And you can go listen to some of those episodes. Really interesting.
Yeah. So we've got Dan Garrett, and he's either a cop in chainmail, and then Charlton buys the rights to the character and gives him this magical amulet. It's a beetle, Kajida, magic powers. And that's about all there is to really understand about Dan Garrett. He's sort of, he's a 40s hero.
40s hero. Right. Powers are the
Then, in the 60s, in the late 60s, Charlton Comics undergoes a big relaunch. This is where Captain Atom comes from. This is where The Question comes from. And under a guy named Steve Ditko, they launch a new Blue Beetle. Steve Ditko, you listeners may know as as the artist behind Spider-Man.
Yep.
This is important because, in a big picture sense, the second Blue Beetle, when he launches, Ted Kord, when he first debuts, is a shameless Spider-Man knockoff.
I don't know what you mean. He seems entirely original.
I can explain. So, among other things, he has... So I'll give you the story of Ted Kord, and we'll hit some beats that will be familiar. He is a star student of Dan Garrett's. The premise is he's Dan Garrett's, like, archaeology pupil. When fighting, Ted Kord's evil Uncle Jarvis reveals that he is building an army of robots to take over the world.
That tracks.
Dan Garrett summons the Blue Beetle armor to fight him and is killed. Ted Kord steps in and saves the day, like beats his uncle, saves the day, but is there to witness the death of his mentor.
Okay.
He then has to step into the roles of a hero and be a hero while grappling with the guilt that his mentor figure died, and could he have done more to stop it?
That doesn't sound anything like Peter Parker.
Yeah, right? That's just a whole new character. Steve Ditko was famously bitter about leaving Spider-Man, so, like, him making, like, there's a whole element of, like, he's just wanted to write more Spider-Man comics, and it makes me so happy that he just was like, no, I'm doing Spider-Man again.
You have a thing about creators who leave Marvel to go do something else.
I do have a soft spot for people that bounce out of Marvel. And the other thing that I think is fun, that it, like, always makes me laugh, is there's a very iconic Ted Kord Blue Beetle pose, which is he's got the Bug, which is his flying ship. The Bug has a grappling cable that shoots down, and Ted Kord swings on that. So his, like, iconic pose is just Spider-Man swinging on a web, but with slightly more justification.
More blue.
I love it. I love it to death, Rich. I cannot... It's so good. So, but yeah, he is Dan Garrett's student pupil, and when Dan Garrett dies, Ted Kord steps in. And the main thing is Ted Kord steps in, he tries to use the magical amulet, and for some reason it doesn't work. You know, he says the words, it just doesn't work. So Ted Kord has to use his technical know-how and basically step into the roles of this, like, famous mystical superhero with nothing but gadgets and know-how.
Gotcha.
He just bluffs his way through it. He builds a flying ship. He builds, like, a flash gun that blinds his enemies. He just builds a bunch of gadgets and says, like, this will have to do because I don't have magical powers.
Right, gotcha.
But he never says, I'm not going to do this. He just figures out a new way to work. This is one of the things that I really like about this character.
I love it.
So, and then he has some adventures in the Charlton comics. He teams up with the Question a few times. This will come up later. But, like, on the whole, that run it's not terribly interesting. The interesting stuff with Ted Kord comes much later. This is just, like, laying the seeds. Right now we have a fun Spider-Man analog character with sort of an adorable pseudo-mystical tech gimmick.
Yeah. So, real quick, in the last episode, you kept blowing my mind with stuff I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at the outline right now. I think this next thing you're going to talk about is blowing my mind.
Okay, cool. I'm excited.
I made some reference to in that Captain Atom mini Origins that he was an inspiration for Dr. Manhattan. I didn't realize that was just the foot in the door.
There's a whole lot, Rich.
Please continue.
Let me get
Sir,
there.
Professor Stormer.
So, in the 80s, DC buys out Charlton Comics, buys everything. And they have done this with every studio under the sun. They bought Charlton, they bought Fawcett, which is where they get Captain Marvel. They buy at least one or two more. I forget. I know Fawcett and Charlton are two of the big ones, and then they've got, their older Golden Age stuff. They've got the Silver Age stuff. They've got a million different universes, which when we have Infinite Earths, the only thing we can do with them is crisis them all together.
Right, exactly.
So Ted Kord is in Crisis on Infinite Earths, and I say this with pure love, he's just Spider-Man. Like, he's there to be quippy and sarcastic and give comic relief. That's his only role in the story.
Right.
And so, like, but then Crisis happens, and then we have to figure out what the post-Crisis universe looks like. And no one is quite sure where that's going to go. Which is when a young British author comes to DC with a script and says, I want to do a Charlton...
Random nobody. It's random.
Some random guy. Comes to them with a script and says, I want to do a Charlton Comics crossover book. And Alan Moore at this point is semi-popular in DC. He's done a few runs he's done some high-profile books. He's got a little bit of pull. And they say, okay, you want to pitch us this Charlton Comics crossover book. And he says, all right. So the premise is, the Peacemaker and everybody goes, no. And he goes, good, because he's going to get murdered right off the bat. And the Question and he lays out, and like the Question and Blue Beetle have to investigate his murder. And then there's a huge shocking twist. Also, Captain Atom is there, but he's lost touch with humanity. He lays out this sprawling pitch. And DC says, we can't let you do that with, like, our characters that we want to use in other contexts.
Right.
So he just, so Alan Moore just straight changes their names.
Right.
And Watchmen is born.
Right. Because Rorschach is so the Question.
Oh, for sure. He's got a mask. He's got no face on because he's wearing a mask.
Right.
He's wearing a trench coat and a fedora. And he has an important thing about Steve Ditko, who also created The Question, is he is a staunch believer in, like, Ayn Randian objectivism.
Uh-huh.
A is A, will always be A. And so Rorschach never compromises because The Question was Steve Ditko's Randian objectivism mouthpiece.
In fact, that line, A is A, shows up in Justice League Unlimited.
It does.
With The Question.
And it's one of my favorite moments of the series.
Oh, when he faces off with Lex Luthor? So good.
And he gives that monologue, and you think that he's going to, like, take control of the situation, and then Lex Luthor just beats the snot out of him.
Absolutely destroys The Question. The Question is so good in Justice League Unlimited.
And we're going to get to that, because it's important, it's a major detail.
All right, let's do it.
So yeah, if you read Watchmen, knowing, like, the history of Charlton Comics, every character is a Charlton Comics character, because that's the way it was written. Rorschach, the faceless vigilante in a trench coat and fedora who never compromises even in the face of Armageddon, is The Question. The all-powerful atomic Superman is Captain Atom. But also Dr. Manhattan. And we come to Night Owl, the legacy hero, gadgeteer, who is following in the footsteps of a cop whose natural abilities he has to make up for with technology.
And has a flying owl ship. I did not know this. Oh my god. Yeah, this is awesome.
Yeah, he's 100% Ted. Like, he is actively based on Ted Kord.
I am absolutely ashamed I didn't see all of this already.
Mm-hmm. And the thing about Watchmen is it becomes so popular, and it's very interesting because it blows up to such a degree that character traits from Watchmen bleed back into the DC universe, even when they weren't necessarily prevalent in those characters to begin with.
Interesting.
So if you read Question comics like the original Ditko run, he is a hardline conservative, like, talk radio host or newscaster. It's not until Watchmen comes that they start making him, like, a dangerous conspiracy theorist.
Right.
Because Rorschach is a dangerous conspiracy theorist, and that becomes something about The Question.
Oh my gosh, I never saw that. You're absolutely right.
He takes on the qualities of Rorschach because Rorschach becomes such a fundamentally important character. So even though they said you can't use Charlton characters, those Charlton characters ended up becoming like their Watchmen equivalents.
Oh, wow.
And this ties back into Ted Kord because Night Owl is a few things about Night Owl is he's out of shape. He stopped being a hero and he becomes sort of paunchy and like he gets a gut. He has terrible self-loathing issues, like he just hates himself. And he kind of accidentally charms Silk Spectre. Like, he's accidentally charismatic, despite the fact that he's kind of bumbling.
Right.
All of this bleeds back into Ted Kord around the time DC says, oh, we figured out what we're going to do with the Ted Kord character. This brings us to Justice League International. My favorite run of comics of all time.
Of course it does.
So, right after Crisis, DC launches the Justice League International.
Uh-huh.
And they're but they can't use Superman. They can't use Wonder Woman. And I think they can't use Hal Jordan. They can't use a lot of the, like, mainstays of the Justice League. The Green Lantern they have to use is Guy Gardner.
Right.
And so Justice League International becomes this very weird book about a bunch of oddball second-string superheroes and it ends up becoming a goofy comedy. I've heard it described as Cheers for superheroes, and that's pretty accurate. And Ted Kord is front and center. He is a founding member of the Justice League International. And it is here where he meets and befriends Booster Gold, time traveler from the future who has come back to cash in on knowing things that are going to unfold.
Right.
Booster Gold is drafted to the Justice League by corporate founder Maxwell Lord, who is sort of a scumbag business type, not necessarily a Lex Luthor, more of just a sleazy 80s businessman.
Uh-huh.
And he drafts Booster Gold specifically because he is a money-making opportunity.
Right.
Booster and Ted hit it off immediately. And they hate each other, but they're friends, and then they just start doing dumb pranks all the time.
Right.
This is where Ted Kord becomes famous for Bwahaha, his signature laugh. Because he's just, they do dumb things all the time, and it's perfect, and I love it. And they become best friends, and also, a thing that also happens that is very important, and defines his run on the Justice League, and defines a lot of his character role outside of that, is he ends up on what is called monitor duty a lot.
Right.
Basically, they tell him, watch the screens and tell us if you need us. And this defines a lot of the idea that, like, nobody really takes Ted Kord seriously.
Uh-huh.
They sort of put him on monitor duty, and then he rises to the occasion when they need him. So we get a lot of the things that, like, the character of Ted Kord is really formed in Justice League International. And a lot of that comes from Watchmen as well, because it is established that Ted Kord, when he had to follow in Dan Garrett's footsteps, he did so through, like, this hyper high-tech training regimen. Think what Ivan Drago goes through in Rocky IV.
Right.
But it becomes canon that he hasn't done that in a while.
Okay.
So he just gets out of shape again. And so Ted Kord, the famous sort of post-crisis vision of Ted Kord, has this gut. Like, he's muscular, but he's got, like, kind of a paunch. And as a guy that's mostly in shape, but with a paunch, like, I really identify with that. And he develops these self-esteem issues because nobody takes him seriously, and they're always putting him on monitor duty. And he starts to doubt his ability to be a real, honest hero.
Right.
And he becomes very Night Owl-esque in a way that I deeply love.
I love it.
And eventually, like, he becomes the jokester of the Justice League alongside Booster Gold, where they do things like purchase the island of Kui 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 and open a gambling resort there with Justice League money, unbeknownst to Maxwell Lord.
Jeez.
It's real dumb. It's real dumb, and I love it. And so he becomes this kind of lovely character of a guy that is trying his best, even if it's not that great, but he's doing it because he knows he has to, and he has to rise to the occasion.
Yeah.
And and he's also just doing it because it's fun, and he hangs out with his friends. I really like Ted Kord.
I'm sorry, I'm still reeling from all of this Watchmen parallel situation going on. I'm going to have to reread Watchmen with a whole new set of eyes.
And it's funny because a lot of the characters in Watchmen are not characters that DC ever ended up doing anything with. Like, the Peacemaker,
Right.
Or Pete Cannon, Thunderbolt.
Right.
And so, like, that's one of the reasons that it becomes very easy to not pick up on it.
Right.
But, like, there's a plot point of, like, in the late days of superheroes before they pass the Registration Act.
Right.
The two people that are still, like, kind of holding out the longest are Night Owl and Rorschach, who are teaming up and they team up specifically because Question and Blue Beetle team up in the original Charlton Comics run, because they're both being written by Steve Ditko.
Right, right.
And so, like, it was very consciously written with these characters in mind, but it kind of works better with non-copyrighted characters, because it allows them to do things that... It allows them to it allows a sense of finality that you'll never get with superheroes.
Well, and also, I mean, I look at, all I can picture is Rorschach in the prison. And I just, seeing it as Rorschach I'm like, that's Rorschach, I get that. I think that would have, it's weird because I like Rorschach as a character in the context of the Watchmen universe. I might have a harder time accepting the Question the way that I do now if I had seen the Question doing those things in the prison, right?
Yeah, I know, for sure. And part of that for me is that, like...
Because it's not very DC. It's just not very DC, you know?
Exactly, yeah. They're allowed to be repugnant.
Right.
You're allowed to be characters that I don't like. You know, you're not supposed to like Rorschach.
Yeah, I don't like Rorschach. I don't want to go, like, hang out with Rorschach. That's not what I mean, of course.
Right, for sure.
I like him as the character that he is for the part that he's playing in the story that we have, right? He's brilliant. He's a puzzle piece that fits, right?
Yes.
But it's funny because, like I was saying before, the Question that shows up in Justice League Unlimited, who's he voiced by? Jeffrey Combs?
Yes, Jeffrey Combs.
Oh my gosh.
Reanimator.
He was just brilliant, right? I mean, to the point where they're having a meeting and something's going on and Batman's in the meeting with all the Justice League and he's like, I put the Question on it. And everybody's all, oh, not that nutcase, right? And Batman says, I know he's got a couple of screws loose. Like, when Batman's saying, like...
He has my two favorite lines, maybe in all of Justice League.
Oh, yeah. I one of them, I think I know what it is.
He says, when he's getting tortured by Cadmus, and they pull off the shockers, and he goes, right. the tiny caps on the edge of shoelaces are called aglets. Their true purpose is sinister. And then he's on the phone. The episode Double Date, which is written by Gail Simone.
So good. Double Date's so good.
He's talking on the phone with the Huntress, and she's, like, following up on a lead.
Right.
And, like, the scene ends, and she's just sitting there like, so what are you wearing? Yellow shirt, black tie, fedora, jacket. You're hopeless. Orange socks? Oh, it's my everything.
If you haven't seen Double Date, it's so good. It's Green Arrow and Black Canary. I didn't realize it was written by Gail Simone. No wonder it was so good. It was Black Canary and Green Arrow and Question and Huntress. And it's just so good. It just makes me smile, just laugh, just thinking about it. It's so good. Oh, all right. So
one of my favorite episodes.
It's fantastic. The question is great. And in later episodes too, he's involved in a much darker episode too with Supergirl, which was really good and kind of like you watch him doing what he's doing and wondering why he's doing it. Like he has this like edge of compassion sort of for Supergirl, and that's really good too. Anyway, enough about Question. So let's get back to Ted. Sure. So we see him in Justice League International, but he shows up in a bunch of other stuff now, and he's become a fan favorite.
At this point, he's a fan favorite. He never really gets his own, like, run.
Nope.
He might get a run here and there, but, like, it's never, like, a starring thing. Which I think is I've always thought is for the best. He's definitely a character that works really well as part of an ensemble.
Yeah, I think so too, yeah.
The one that always stands out to me, my favorite, is he shows up as a supporting character in Birds of Prey.
Right. Which is, explain Birds of Prey.
Birds of Prey is Gail Simone again. It is a book about Barbara Gordon, the Oracle, organizing a team of basically superhero special ops agents.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Black Canary, Huntress, and Oracle are the three that...
They're like cornerstone, the main characters, but they get a bunch of other people that come in. I think
there's a huge
Catwoman comes
roster
in for a while, and like there's she has some guest spots in there, and they end up working with a bunch of the other female characters that female heroes and male heroes too, but
Big Barda plays a big role for a while.
Of course, you would know that.
Oh, she has one of my favorite moments because they're on a plane. They're on a plane, and Big Barda's just like chatting, and they're like, "Hey, Barda, you're all right?" And she looks down, and she's like riddled, like she's got like 5 bullet holes in her leg, and she's like, "Oh, I've been shot. Allow me to seek medical assistance." And I'm like, "That's so good."
It's so Barda.
So he shows up sporadically in that, which is where he begins kind of flirting with and wooing Barbara Gordon. The two of them become very flirtatious friends.
Like over the mic or something? Or like in person? Like, well, she's Oracle. Like he's flirting with Oracle and he doesn't realize it's Barbara?
A little, it's that. It's kind of both. I think he starts out working with Oracle and flirting with her, and then they have some face-to-face meetings.
Okay.
And they flirt with each other. They have this very flirtatious friendship. They ultimately decide they're better off as friends. But, spoiler alert, Ted Cord is killed.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that, right?
And it's funny because they'd always been very flirtatious and very like, flirtatious is the right. They've always been very flirtatious, but they've always been very much like, no, we're better off as friends. Let's not go down this road.
Interesting. Okay, this went in a direction I wasn't expecting. All right. Yeah, sorry for the spoiler, guys, but Ted doesn't make it out alive in the comics either. So that's where some of this inspiration comes from. But there's some other stuff to get to before that. I mean, there's a lot going on, right?
The main thing to get to before that is the book that got me into comics.
Right.
Is a book called formerly known as the Justice League.
Okay. And is this a graphic novel, like a one-shot, or is this a collection?
This was a mini series.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a graphic novel like a one-shot. There's technically 2. There's a sequel comic called I Can't Believe It's Not the Justice League.
Okay.
This was the guys that did Justice League International, Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis, are brought back like 10 years later, or like 15 years later. Yeah, like 10, 15 years later, to do a sequel comic to the Justice League International. And the premise is that Maxwell Lord, owning a strip mall storefront, relaunches his version of the Justice League to just fight like neighborhood crime.
Oh, Max.
So he goes out and he rounds up Ted Cord, Booster Gold, Fire because Ice is dead at the time.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
Mary Marvel because Captain Marvel says he wants nothing to do with the Justice League. Captain Atom is there. Elongated Man and Sue Dibney. And I think Rocket Red might show up briefly. I know Guy Gardner shows up in the sequel book.
Okay.
But he rounds up just whomever, and this is a time when none of these characters were really doing anything.
Right.
So he just kind of rounds them up and they fight like a neighborhood crime for a while.
Okay.
And it's so good. And that's, like I said, that's the literal... I picked this up off the shelf after watching Justice League and being like, I really like Booster Gold. I'm going to read this book with Booster Gold in it.
Because you watch there's an episode of Justice League called The Greatest Story Never Told, and it's all about Booster Gold being like the hero of the entire like episode, and no one knows it happened.
Thank you, Green Lantern. Not even wearing green.
He's like, the kid, nobody knows who he is.
So I watched that episode, and I fell in love with Booster Gold. And I was at a comic shop, and they had formerly known as the Justice League on the stands. And I said, "Hi, that's Booster Gold. I'm going to read this." And I fell in love with every single one of these characters. Nice. Every single one of them. By the time I was reading this book, I was like, "Yep, I'm going to read, and I'm going to read everything. I'm going to learn everything about Elongated Man. I'm going to learn everything about Mary Marvel. I'm going to learn everything about Fire and Ice."
Nice.
So the main thing that comes out of Super Buddies is Ted Kord has a heart condition.
Oh, wow.
He's actually had several heart attacks and did not realize it because, like, he was getting beat up as a superhero.
Right.
And so he's like, I'm not being a superhero. I can't do this anymore. It's dangerous to my health.
Right.
And they drag him back in because he can't resist the lifestyle.
Of course.
And, like, hanging out with his friends.
Right.
So he hangs out with them. They go on some adventures. And it's just, these books are just the goofiest, like, character beats. And that's all it is.
Right.
I love those books, Rich. I really like them.
I'm
going to go back and reread them after this recording.
Which is interesting to me because things get super dark right after this. And
not even necessarily right after this. I can't believe it's not the Justice League is published after it gets super dark. And there's a bunch of jokes that the guys put in there.
Yeah.
To be like, yeah, you remember what's happening in the main DC comics? Lol, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it gets dark. All right, let's turn that corner.
Which brings us to 2005. Countdown to Infinite Crisis. Infinite Crisis was a crisis event. They're all the same.
Right. They're all the same.
Hot take, all crisis events are the same. Don't at me.
Bad things happen, usually involving more than one dimension.
Yes. In the build up to this big event, the first thing that drops is a book called Countdown to Infinite Crisis, starring Ted Kord. In the book, Ted Kord is investigating this mysterious conspiracy that no one else is able to pick up on. He kind of is investigating this. He goes to Batman, and Batman's like, I don't have any information on this, and I've got eyes everywhere.
Right.
He goes to Booster Gold, but Booster Gold has been, like, beat up in a superhero accident. Which is a major plot point that comes after this.
Right.
Is that Booster Gold takes him seriously, but can't help him because he's injured.
Right.
Martian Manhunter's like, we don't have the resources to commit to some weird conspiracy theory.
Right.
No one takes him seriously, so Ted Kord does it all on his own. He goes out, he investigates all of this, he pieces together the data. The whole time, he's basically like, why couldn't I get anyone to believe me? What is wrong with everyone?
Right.
And he finally pieces together that there's an organization called Checkmate that is gathering data on superheroes to basically take down the Justice League. Like, expose them, break them, kill them, remove them from the board. At the head of this, it is revealed to be none other than Ted Kord's old friend and boss, Maxwell Lord.
Right.
How this ties in with the years-long arc of Maxwell Lord discovering a conscience and a soul, and all those thought bubbles he had when he was by himself about, like, maybe superheroes are okay after all. Maybe I could be a good person. We don't ask those questions. DC certainly didn't.
They did not ask those questions.
And Ted Kord cracks all of this, and Maxwell Lord is like, yeah, I hate superheroes, and the world would be better off without them.
Right.
And he comes to Ted Kord and he says, you don't have superpowers. You're just one of us. You could side with Checkmate and, like, be on our side. That's the only way out of this for you. And Ted Kord says, even after every single member of the Justice League has turned their back on Ted Kord says, that's not the right thing to do. I'm going to be a hero. I'm not taking your offer. And he gets shot in the head and his body thrown in a furnace.
Yeah.
The meta-narrative here is that DC Comics had made a concentrated effort in, like, the years 2003 to 2005-ish to be darker.
Yeah.
Because they said it's time for superheroes to grow up. I'm not going to rant about Identity Crisis, but Identity Crisis is the worst book that I've ever read.
There was some messed up stuff in it. We'll go with there.
So they consciously were like, we are going to make our books dark. They picked Ted Kord as a happy-go-lucky goofball comedy character and shot him in the head to show, hey, we're not playing around anymore. Superheroes are serious business, and sometimes people just get shot in the head.
Yeah. I remember my jaw dropping. I was like, wait, what just happened? I've never been a fan of Maxwell Lord, but also Checkmate was an established comic for a very long time before that. So it's not like Checkmate was like some new organization that Maxwell Lord had just happened to be like head of. There was definitely a few things where I was like, what's happening right now? So the death of Ted motivates a bunch of people, right?
Yeah, it basically is the moment that Batman realizes that he doesn't have as firm a grip on things as he thought he did. Booster Gold has basically a breakdown, vanishes into the future, and comes back with like an updated list of events, and he's like, I'm going to make it so that this never happened.
Right. And
all of these things happen. Infinite Crisis happens, this big event, the crux of which is a Superman from the Golden Age Superman comes back and says, you've all lost your way. I am going to take the place of the new Superman and show you all what it was like in the old days. And Golden Age Batman comes with him. These are all these superheroes from Earth 2, which is the original publicated date of superheroes. It's a world in which Superman debuts in 1938 and ages naturally.
Right.
But he's been removed from time since 1986. Comics are weird.
Right.
And basically, like, the whole premise is like alternate versions of these characters forcing the confrontation of you have morally lost your way and have stopped being the version of you that you like.
Right.
This leads into a book called 52, in which Booster Gold comes back in time, tries to save things, fights a multi-dimensional version of Mr. Mind, who was a little worm that battled Captain Marvel.
Right.
A lot of things happen. I'm a big fan of 52, and I highly recommend it. I don't mean to spoil things in it, because I think it's a worthy read. It also has a really great Ralph Dibny story where he becomes, like, a badass detective.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Oh, yeah.
It's so good. I'm a big fan of 52.
Bit of a side note. So Jeff and I were both on a show called Geek Wars, in which Jeff beat me at Geek Wars. And then I got my revenge with Ralph Dibny.
You did. You did get your revenge with Ralph Dibny.
So after I came off the show, Geek Wars is one of the shows on the Dungeon Masters Block network. DM Mitch had asked me to submit some questions, and so I did. And one of the questions I submitted got Jeff.
You did. The question was, who is the second best detective in the DC universe? Keeping in mind that Batman is the world's best detective. And I came down to two people because I couldn't remember their respective titles. The answer was Ralph Dibny. I said Detective Chimp,
which is a worthy throw in. I have to tell you,
because Detective Chimp's title is the best non-human is the world's best non-human detective.
Right.
And then Ralph Dibny's is the world's second best detective.
Yeah, I was very proud that I at least got you on one. But when I heard Detective Chimp was up, I was like, "Ooh, that's a good one. That was a good effort. Good effort."
I love Detective Chimp. As he wears a Sherlock Holmes hat.
He does, and he shows up in Batman: Brave and the Bold a couple times.
He does.
He's pretty great. Yeah. I don't know what the thing is with I just got to find out what DC's thing is with apes. It's like gorilla villains and chimpanzees. They're just everywhere. Anyway, all right. So we're at 52 and moving into the quote unquote new 52, right? So 52 was 52 comics published once a week for a year with this storyline, which was pretty impressive.
And as that's happening, so what happens is after Infinite Crisis, DC skips all of their comics ahead a year. They do the 1 year later event, where every comic starts out having missed a year, and everything is different. All sorts of events have happened that we don't know about. And then 52 tells the story of that missing year, week by week. And it's super cool. It ultimately becomes a Booster Gold, Ralph Dibny steal, and Renee Montoya / The Question.
Yeah, the old Question dies, and Renee Montoya, who's the police detective you might know from Batman the Animated Series, becomes the new Question. And she's been the new Question since, yeah?
I think they rolled that back for the New 52 reboot.
Oh,
but
for
they may
Rebirth?
No, for the New 52.
Oh, interesting.
When they relaunched. So there's 52, and then there's the new 52, which are different things, and it's all very confusing because they name everything so similarly.
Right.
It's obnoxious.
Right.
So yeah, Renee Montoya becomes the new Question, and her run as the Question is super cool, and that's also where we get the character of Batwoman,
Right.
which is it's real good.
Which is a relaunch of Batwoman because she was originally a character from back in the day too. So anyway, but that's a whole different podcast.
So the crux of all of this is that Ted Kord is dead. And in the 13 or so years since then, Ted Kord, especially since Barry Allen came back, Ted Kord has sort of cemented his place as the hero that is dead.
Right.
Which is different than Dead Man, who is the dead person who is a hero.
Who is still a hero, right.
Ted Kord has just been dead, and people have reacted to him like a hero who died. And as much as I don't like Countdown to Infinite Crisis, I love everything that has come after, because they play it as a bunch of characters going, he was our friend, and he was a hero, and we miss him.
Yeah.
Like, the Birds of Prey go to his grave and mourn him, and like, Booster Gold has this entire arc where there's this beautiful issue of Booster Gold where he's like, I'm gonna save Ted. I'm gonna fix it. And his mentor, Rip Hunter, the Time Master, has to literally be like, you cannot stop some things from happening. Ted Kord is going to die. And he saves him anyway, and all of time gets messed up. And he's like, I have to let my friend die, or else everything goes to hell. And it's this beautiful, heartbreaking thing of like, this happened, and we all have to deal with it.
There's like a panel from that. Isn't that where that panel where it's just Booster with his helmet off and he's all beaten up and he's just like real quietly saying, I just wanted to have my friend back. Something breaks my heart.
Because what happens because what happens is Rip Hunter is showing him that some moments can't be changed, because he tells him like, look, if you're gonna save Ted, here's what you have to do. Go stop Barbara Gordon from getting shot by the Joker. And Booster Gold shows up, gets beaten with a crowbar, and Barbara Gordon gets shot. And Booster Gold's like, I can do it. I can do this, because if I can't do this, I can't save Ted. So the whole issue is him showing up moments beforehand, getting beaten by the Joker again and again and again. And finally Rip Hunter's like, why do you keep doing this? And that's when he just breaks down. He's like, I just want my friend back.
It's just so heartbreaking.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
And I just love the idea that I love Ted Kord as a hero who really shines in death. It's sort of perfect.
Yeah.
And all of this, the final beat to touch on is when he finally, in Infinite Crisis, it is a plot point that Ted Kord had held on to Dan Garrett's amulet this entire time for years, decades. And when he dies, he's on a space station, it falls to Earth, and it lands on Jaime Reyes.
Right.
It digs itself into his back, it becomes his super suit. And so Jaime Reyes becomes the new Blue Beetle. And the final beat is there's a single issue of the Jaime Reyes Blue Beetle series, which you should read from beginning to end, because it's dope.
Nice. I haven't read it.
Oh, it's written by John Rogers, if I remember correctly.
Whoa, wait, John Rogers
really
from... Wait, you talking about the TV producer, writer John Rogers? Who did the Librarians, and he did... John Rogers did Leverage, John Rogers did...
yes.
I think he did the Librarians.
Yep. That John Rogers wrote the relaunched Blue Beetle comic. He also wrote the greatest run of Dungeons and Dragons comics that I've ever read, but that is neither here nor there.
I'm totally picking up the Blue Beetle. Like, I love Ted Kord too, for so many of the reasons that you love Ted Kord. And when they went to Jaime Reyes, and it was just like, oh, it's a random kid who gets a powered armored suit. The powered armored suit heroes I like them. I think they're cool. They typically don't drive me as a character, because it's typically just a person, like without the suit, I'm nothing kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I was expecting from Jaime. And to be perfectly honest, like, until I saw Jaime in Young Justice, I wasn't interested. And then I saw Jaime and Young Justice, and I was like, I'm an idiot. This character is so compelling, and I haven't gone back to reread his stuff yet.
You should go back and read the 2006 John Rogers Jaime Reyes comic, because it's fantastic. It is so good, and it plays off of that idea that he is not necessarily the person that should have this legacy, but like he owns it in it's such a perfect way.
Yeah.
And the closing thing that I want to talk about is there's an issue of that run that I think symbolizes everything that I love about Ted Kord as a character and Ted Kord as a deceased legacy character.
Okay.
There is an issue of the John Rogers Blue Beetle run where Guy Gardner shows up. And Guy Gardner basically, the plot point that I want to talk about is Guy Gardner grabs Blue Beetle, takes him to his bar, because Guy Gardner owns a bar, because of course he does.
Of course he does.
And plops him down on oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to do a stupid sidebar. I think he got the bar when he wasn't a lantern anymore, and he was a character called the Warrior. He was like a shape-shifting alien weirdness, because comics. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, that is correct. So he takes him to his bar, he sits him down, and he hands Jaime Reyes, like, a stack of 12 books, like hardcover textbooks.
Okay.
And he says, "You are Blue Beetle now." And the Blue Beetle that I knew, Ted Kord was the smartest guy I knew. He didn't have magic, he didn't have powers. What he had was a brain. And he learned everything he could to be the best hero he could. Aww. And he taught all of us to be the best heroes we could. And when we didn't know what we were doing, he forced us to learn. And it's revealed that, like, he's handing him all of these books that Ted Kord gave to Guy Gardner on tactics and, like, martial arts and all of these, like, things to learn how to be a better superhero. And it's like, if you're going to carry on this legacy, if you're going to if you're going to carry the name that my friend carried, you're going to carry on his legacy and learn everything you can.
Oh, Guy, don't make me like you. That's amazing. That's so amazing. Good. And
that's Ted Kord. He's a guy that couldn't make the magical amulet work.
Right.
So he found another way to do it. And when he was surrounded by people who were better suited for the job than him, well, then he was able to relax and have fun with his friend.
Right.
And when no one took him seriously, he stared down Armageddon and said, "I'm going to side with the heroes. I'm not siding with the villains, even if it means death." And he died, and his legacy is people saying, "Okay, then I'm going to be the best hero I can be, because that's what my friend Ted would have wanted."
Oh, so good.
And that's Ted Kord.
Oh my gosh. You did it again. You did it again. You did it again. You've changed how I view things that I've been reading for decades. I own Blue Beetle comics from Charlton and Captain Atom comics. That's when I started reading them, before they became DC characters back in the 70s. So, I'm thinking I know what I'm talking about. And once again, you've come on the show to say, have a seat, Rich. Let's learn something. So I don't know what else to say. Jeff, thanks so much for coming back on the show and bringing us all up to speed on Ted Kord and Blue Beetle and all of those relationships, which may or may not come up in a season 3. But either way, I am walking away from this knowing way more than I did when I walked in.
I don't expect Ted Kord to come up in season 3 beyond to reference to his legacy, because he is a character at this point that is pretty well established as the hero that is dead.
Yeah.
What I expect to come up is I've been expecting Booster Gold to show up since Bart Allen comes from the future.
Right.
And since, especially in season 3, now that we know that, the future that Bart Allen was from was theoretically fixed. Maybe?
Yeah. Yeah, as far as we know, it's fixed.
So I so want Booster Gold in season 3 to come from the future that is fixed and be like, I'm here from the future to get paid.
Right. And so here's the thing with Booster. So Booster worked at a museum, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And a museum for superhero history,
Yep.
stole a bunch of superhero stuff from history and then went back in time to be a superhero because he thought it would make him money. So he has powered armor in these suits and all this kind of stuff. But here's the thing that gets me. He flies using a Legion of Superheroes 30th century flight ring. So anybody who's listened to the show enough knows how much I love Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, how badly I want to have a Young Justice version of the Legion in the show. And Booster carrying a Legion flight ring would make me so happy.
I love Booster Gold.
Yeah.
He is a disgraced football star who is disgraced because he bet on himself and lost.
Right.
And that's how he ends up as a custodian in the superhero museum. He goes back, and his initial plan is to go back and stop crimes that he knows are going to happen.
Right.
But then realizes that, like, in order to be at a time where he can stop those crimes, he has to be so far back that, like, history doesn't line, like, that, like, there's no way he has the information that he needs to go back thousands and thousands of years and be a superhero at the time when he would have to be one for his legacy to be cemented. So he just kind of pretends, and it's so good. I love Booster Gold.
I think in our last episode you said he's the biggest idiot, and I love him.
Yes, I said it correctly. Yes, he is a gigantic idiot, and I love him to death, and will protect him forever.
Nice. Well, if you want to know about Booster, definitely go watch the Justice League Unlimited episode, The Greatest Story Never Told. You will get a classic view of who Booster is and why we're talking about him in such a way. And I am definitely going back and checking out the John Rogers Blue Beetle run. We'll put links to that in the show notes. We'll also have links to the Blue Beetle radio show. You can check those out, and then a link to a bunch of other stuff that myself and Jeff have been on, including that Geek Wars, where you can hear Jeff school me on other things professionally. Thank you so much for spending time with us in the Watchtower, Jeff. Where can people find you here on Earth Prime?
You can find me on Twitter at Party of One Pod. That is where you'll find information about Party of One. You can find All My Fantasy Children on Twitter at AMFC_podcast or at allmyfantasychildren.com. You can also find Party of One at partyofonepodcast.com. And I think that's it. Yes, that's it. Because it's not December and I'm not plugging my once-a-year eggnog podcast.
We'll get you back for December. Let us know.
All right.
And thanks to everyone for sharing some time with us. You can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files, on Facebook at Crashing the Mode, on theyjfiles.tumblr.com, on our website, crashingthemode.com, our email address, whelmedpodcast@gmail.com, and by the time this airs, you will now be able to find all of our episodes on YouTube at crashingthemode.com/YouTube, including playlists that divide up all of our different types of episodes, our discussion sessions, Super Sweethearts, Secret Origins, review episodes, and more in playlists. You can watch them. You can watch listening to them. Watching? I don't know how you even call that. Back to back. If you enjoy our show, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can also support the show by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes or your podcatcher of choice. The ratings help others find the show. If you do leave us a rating, please let us know, especially if you're outside the U.S. We have to look a little harder to find those, though I hopefully got some things set up to make it a little easier. And even though Season 3 is almost on its way, as of yesterday, I heard Carrie Payton announce they have recorded all 26 episodes. So now it's just the production bits. Please continue to spread the word to friends and family about the series. #BuyYJComics on Comixology to get more stories even sooner and get yourself up to speed for the Season 3 premiere. And as always,
stay whelmed, everyone.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our hosts are Rich Howard and Emily Booza. Our editor and producer is Neil Powell. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.